Insulin and glucagon work to maintain blood nutrients. Let's look at diabetes mellitus and see what's happening here. So here is the pancreas, and here is a cell. So if we look at this situation, the healthy situation. In a healthy situation, you get rising blood glucose. In response to that, the pancreas secretes insulin. The insulin binds to receptors on the cells. And the cells take up the glucose. So here you can see the glucose goes into the cell. And as a result of taking up the glucose, the blood glucose level goes down. And because it goes down now, you are in homeostasis. So this is what happens every time you eat. The next two pictures show what can go wrong with this system. So we have type 1 diabetes mellitus and type 2 diabetes mellitus. So let's look at the type 1 diabetes mellitus. In this case, the pancreas fails to produce insulin. So this is when you get an infection of the pancreas. By a virus. Your immune system goes to kill the virus, but it messes up and destroys parts of your pancreas instead. And you're left unable to produce insulin. So then, when you have rising blood glucose, there's no insulin to secrete to bind to the receptors. So here you can see the empty receptor. So because there's no insulin, blood glucose goes up, but without the insulin, the cells don't take the glucose. So notice the glucose just remains in the blood. So then you get very high blood glucose levels in the hundreds because it just builds up in the blood. So what ends up happening is the kidneys filter this glucose out when they make urine. So then that glucose is lost in the urine. So this is why diabetes causes glucose in the urine. Also, because you have that glucose in the urine, you get excess urine. So people with diabetes go to the bathroom a lot. Glucose has osmotic pressure. It attracts water. So all that glucose in the urine attracts more water into the urine. And the actual name here, diabetes, if you look at diabetes mellitus, what this actually means, diabetes is excess urine. And that's because the glucose is osmotic and attracts water. And mellitus means honey. The urine of a diabetic tastes sweet like honey. And in the old days, before modern technology, doctors would diagnose diabetes by tasting their patient's urine. Now, it's not that they would like drink a whole cup full of it, but they would dip their finger in the urine and then touch their finger to their tongue to see if it tasted sweet. So be thankful you live today when we have just those little glucose test strips you can dip into urine. Another thing that you often see with type 1 diabetes is weight loss. This is because since your cells can't use glucose, they can't take it up without insulin. Now this is except your neurons. Neurons are the only cells that can take up glucose without insulin. So if you don't have insulin, your neurons will still get glucose, but none of your other cells can use glucose. So that means they have to use fat instead. And that's why you get weight loss. Your cells are forced to use fat to make ATP instead of using glucose. This also explains the acidosis. If you're familiar with diabetes, you know that it can cause ketoacidosis. This occurs because the cells are using fat to make ATP. You get ketoacids. So with type 1 diabetes, you get sugar in the urine. That's because their cells can't take up the glucose. It builds up in the blood and then the kidneys filter it out. You get excess urine because the glucose is osmotic. It's pulling more water into the urine with it. You get weight loss because since cells can't use glucose, they use fats instead. And you get ketoacidosis because all that burning of fat produces acids that are dumped into the blood. You also have thirst. Frequent thirst is a sign of diabetes. That's because you're dehydrated from all the water being lost in the urine. So diabetics will drink a lot and urinate a lot. But the cause and effect, it's the urinating a lot that causes them to drink a lot. So you can't just say, well, quit drinking so much and then you'll quit peeing so much. It's the other way around. The diabetes is making them urinate so much, and all that urination is causing them to become dehydrated, and the dehydration makes you feel thirsty. So that is type 1 diabetes. And the only treatment for this is insulin shots. Now again, today we're lucky we have treatment. You can take insulin. Hundreds of years ago, before there was insulin that you could just inject into people, people who had diabetes would slowly starve to death. And they could eat and eat and eat all day long, and they would still starve to death. Because without insulin, they had no way to get the nutrients from the blood into their tissues. Okay. Our other one is type 2 diabetes. So if we look at this picture, notice the pancreas is still secreting insulin. There's no problem there. The problem is here with the insulin receptor. In type 2 diabetes mellitus, you lack the insulin receptors on the cells. So let's look at what happens here. This is a spiral. It's a positive feedback cycle. And remember back to chapter 1. Positive feedback doesn't mean it's a good thing. It means that it intensifies. It's a cycle that keeps intensifying. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into this. Genetics is very important, but so is lifestyle. So, a simplified scenario of what happens with type 2 diabetes. If you have poor diet so that you consume lots of sugar or any kind of carbohydrate, because remember, it all gets converted to glucose. So you consume lots of glucose. And you lack exercise. If you exercise, you burn off that glucose. But if you're not exercising, you're not burning it off. So these two factors will combine to give you high blood glucose. Well, the higher your blood glucose is, the more insulin you need. So this means you will also have high insulin. They go together. The more glucose you have, the more insulin you have. Now think back to earlier when we had talked about receptors upregulating and downregulating. If a hormone level is high, that overstimulates the cell. The cell doesn't like that. And so it downregulates. It reduces the number of receptors it has. So having high insulin causes your cells to downregulate. So this means that they lose some of their insulin receptors. So this means that the cells are not responding to the insulin. There's glucose in the blood, there's insulin in the blood, but the cells aren't responding. And if they fail to respond to insulin, that means they fail to take up glucose from the blood. Well, this means that the blood glucose level climbs even higher. Now the glucose builds up in the blood. So this means you have even higher blood glucose level. Well, if your blood glucose is even higher, that means your insulin is going to be higher. What do you think cells are going to do in response to even higher insulin? They're going to downregulate again. This means they have even fewer insulin receptors. So now they're ignoring the insulin even more, and they're taking up less glucose from the blood. Okay, do you see where this is leading? If they're taking even less glucose from the blood, you're going to have even higher blood glucose. And what happens when you have even higher blood glucose? You get even higher insulin. And then what do cells do? As insulin gets higher, they lose more receptors. And this cycle just keeps repeating. Now we're talking about months or years that this cycle repeats, so it's incremental. But the more it repeats, the worse it gets. So when you start off early in this cycle, you can take some oral medications. Some people can even resolve their type 2 diabetes with diet and exercise. The further you get into this cycle, the harder it is to treat. And you can actually get to the point where you become insulin dependent, because you will work your pancreas to death. Because as you go through the cycle, the pancreas keeps having to work harder and harder for diminishing results. And you can actually work your pancreas to death and then become insulin dependent. So that is type 2 diabetes mellitus. So hopefully now diabetes and why those symptoms of diabetes occur makes sense.